Good evening, Bruins, and welcome to the second act. I want to begin by first acknowledging our venue. We're coming here tonight, gathered with you in your living rooms or wherever your Zoom happens to be, versus taking time to gather in JWAC at the West Center, where we might be enjoying a cup of coffee, some lemonade, and a Diddy Reese, okay, maybe 2 or 3 Diddy Reese, and just acknowledge just how much the world has changed since the last time that we were together. And really hoping that in the not too distant future, we'll have that opportunity to gather in the West Center again, to have in-person fellowship and engagement. Really looking forward to that. But again, welcome to the second act. And want to acknowledge that the second act was born out of your feedback. So many of you I know who have tuned in to listen to our session tonight. A couple of years ago, when we began to retool some of the programming in the Alumni Association, many of you raised your hand and said, hey, don't forget about us. Because so much of our programming initially was focused on those who recently graduated. And you raised your hand and said, hey, don't forget about us alumni who are in our 50s and beyond, have some special needs around and requests for our programming. So I want to acknowledge Sia Ford and Justin, who have really created a series of programs, again, based on your feedback, to celebrate those topics that you want to hear about. And so tonight, again, at your request, we have a rock star faculty member, no pressure, Alan Castel, a faculty member in our psychology department who is a international leader in research concerning learning and memory, and a best-selling author. So I'd like to just begin, Alan, by asking you how you and your family are doing sheltering in place at home.
We're surviving. It's definitely a challenge. It's a change of pace, and in some ways a welcomed one, but given the circumstances, I don't think we'd ever expect to be here. But yeah, it's great to try and adapt to these things, but there's only so much you can do. So I'm very curious to hear what other people have to say and how we'll come through all of this.
Which again, knock on whatever we have, we will. Mm-hmm. So I know that all of you have tuned in, have memorized the bio that we sent about you, but so if we could begin maybe in your words, love to hear your story and your journey about what your journey has been about and what led you to land at UCLA, I believe in 2006.
Yeah, I was, in high school, I was really interested in science and math and biology. Never took a psychology class, but I learned to use my memory in ways really to trick my memory into remembering lots of things. So I'd create mnemonics to remember the periodic table, or really things that I didn't care so much about, but I was rewarded for. And I also spent a lot of time, I grew up in Canada, so that explains the thick accent that I have. But I would spend a lot of time in the winter visiting grandparents in South Florida. So I was around a lot of older people. I was embraced by grandparents who were happy to see grandchildren. And so I really grew to know my grandparents during these long breaks. And I noticed that their memory changed over the years, but they were very good at remembering certain things. Like sometimes they'd confuse me and my brother and call us by each other's names, but they could remember other things in a lot of detail. And so that really caused me to think, how does memory change as we get older? How do I use my own memory? And then in college, I took an intro psych class and found it just fascinating. I was a biochemistry major. And I learned that people studied memory in a psychological manner, not just a biological manner. So I eventually switched majors and got involved in research and went to the University of Toronto for my PhD, and then Washington University in St. Louis to examine memory and aging, but also applications to dementia. And then I kept moving west. And so when I got this job offer at UCLA, I couldn't say no. I'm a big basketball fan. I remember I had a high school coach who used to quote John Wooden. So this is familiar territory in some ways. And I'm just happy to be here. I've been here. The years go by fast, almost 14 years. I met my wife here. We have 3 wonderful children. So I'm enjoying Southern California, and I think aging pretty well in this warmer climate.
I totally understand. We had compared notes beforehand how Al grew up in Canada. I grew up in Wisconsin. So we both are really enjoying our seasons in California. I really enjoyed reading your book, Better with Age, and congratulations to you on the success of the book. And one thing I was curious about is it's unusual for a faculty member to have a best-selling book, a lot of incredible publications. And I'm just wondering, how was the writing, or was it different for you in writing the book versus the research articles that you do?
Yeah, well, I think this book project really started even before I got the job offer at UCLA, because I knew when I got this offer, it was right around March Madness. I was a big basketball fan, and I knew I had to meet John Wooden in some way. So I think I used my professional pursuits to angle an interview with Coach Wooden, and someone in my department who teaches leadership, Tara Scanlon, had him come and lecture almost every year. And she said, you know, if you want to interview him, I could see if I could set something up. And she did. And so I appreciated that. And, you know, I had a great interview with Coach Wooden talking about successful aging, his life, his story. And that led to me thinking, gosh, these are really role models of successful aging. And there's so many out there. And so I continued doing these interviews, you know, some over the phone, some with people you'd know, some with people you might not know. And the more interviews I did, the more people told me you should interview this person as well and this person. So the list got longer and longer, but at some point I knew I had to write something. And I thought a book that kind of captured the interviews, but also the latest research and whether it supports it or not would be something that would be useful. And so it was a lot of fun. I think the interviews were more fun than the writing. But at some point I really buckled down and tried to put it all together, and I'm glad I did. It's a book that I'm proud to give to people. I also use it for some of my freshman seminars at UCLA. So I think younger people are learning to change their attitudes about aging, or at least understand the aging process in ways they might not expect.
Well, I think, you know, one of the things that you do in the book is you really challenge us to rethink aging. Where does that start? What does that recommendation for us mean?
Yeah, I think there's many stereotypes and myths that surround aging. And even when we're younger, these things kind of become implanted, that you know, frailty, white hair, Florida, early bird special. You know, some of these stereotypes
my COVID stripe right here.
Well, I also know my gray hair or lack of hair. So, you know, some of these stereotypes definitely fit the bill, but it doesn't have to be that way. And in fact, there's some really clear myths about aging, that it's not all downhill. And although there are challenges, older adults often report being happier than college-age students and experience less, you know, clinical depression if they're healthy. So I think the key is, if you can stay healthy and active, you have a long life to look forward to. So I think if you can get that, you know, get that attitude in your head early in life and then carry it out, there's a lot to look forward to. So I really wanted to kind of capture some of these myths. And there's others, you know, about how to train your brain and, you know, benefits of social interaction that I think we're all aware of now. That I think the more we know, especially earlier in life, the better we can age.
Well, one of the things I appreciated about the book, as you're suggesting also, is that there's a very optimistic spirit about aging in the book. And you talk about how this is a great time to be getting older. And I was wondering, I found myself reflecting on that, you know, recently. Would you have any thoughts about how our present circumstance and this COVID universe, would you say the same?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard not to consider the implications of sheltering in place and being at home, whether that's with loved ones or without, especially if they're far away. And I think that can play a really big role in how we decide to social distance. And I almost feel like social distancing is a bad phrase, because you know, distance is probably important to prevent the disease, but the social part, you can engage in social, you know, just by phone calls, some FaceTime, just
what we're doing right now.
Yeah, I mean, it's never the same as in-person interaction. And I think what a lot of, you know, I'd say middle-aged people notice is that a lot of your social interaction might happen at work, and it's the little things, just seeing people at the water cooler, having lunch with people, a few meetings, and then chit chat afterwards, that really fills your social needs. And when all of these gone, we realize, you know, could I really pick up the phone and call these two coworkers and just talk about something? And so having those social connections are important, and whether it's over the phone or, you know, FaceTime, ideally it's in person, but I think we have to make more of an effort now to engage in interaction.
Mm-hmm. And the follow-up, I think that goes with that. So if I could ask, again, what do you consider successful aging to be? Would that be rare? Is it common?
Yeah, it's a tough definition. And in fact, I think when people first think of successful aging, they think of physical health. That's always an important thing, to keep mobility, to stay free of disease and disability. And some people say, you should pick your parents wisely.
Did your children say that?
In some ways, genetics do play a role, but I think we overemphasize genetics, and we have a lot of control over how we age in terms of exercise, diet, social interactions. So physical is a big component. And, I think that the mental side is just as important, if not bigger, and being aware of how to keep our memory sharp. It's not all about, playing more video games. It's really about trying new things, being around other people who challenge you, having hobbies, having activities that you look forward to. And I think that blends well into the third part of successful aging, which is really some of these social components that we often forget or take for granted. And as we get older, it's probably no surprise we have fewer friends we can turn to, because people move away, people pass away. That's probably the hardest thing to deal with as we get older. But the friends and family that we're close to become more important to us. So those social bonds can be stronger and even more important. So I think when we value those things, even if it's your regular golf group or bridge club or people
Walking
you have
buddies.
lunch with once a month, yeah, sure. It's important to cultivate those relationships. I think we're even more aware of it now during our COVID situation.
Well, and speaking about relationships, and you talked about this a couple minutes ago, as you did when you opened your book. I love the references to your grandparents. I mean, I smiled a lot reading that section, because I share similar kinds of recollections of being with my grandparents and just how great they also made me feel. And then you talked about Wooden, but you also introduced a couple of other role models for successful aging in the book. Could you maybe pick one or two others and reflect on those interviews?
I mean, some of the best interviews were, Bob Newhart was incredibly funny, sarcastic, but he also explained how he couldn't retire. It was hard for him to walk away from his profession. He got a lot of recognition for it, but that's just how he stayed sharp. And if he stopped, he really would worry about himself, as would his family. And I think other comedians, I think as David Letterman said, before you retire to spend more time with your family, check with your family first. Because you really have to be sure what you want to do in retirement. And so having some clear goals, whether it's travel or spend more time with family or hobbies, those transitions can be challenging. So it was great to interview some people who enjoyed their retirement, some people who had retired, but then, went back to the workforce or took on other responsibilities. Some of these interviews were really amazing people, but they're also, the bigger your profession and the more tied you are, the harder it is to walk away from it all. So some of the other interviews, or just the people I spoke to, like my grandparents or other older people, were really enjoying old age, even if they weren't working as much or they were getting kind of, recognition in other ways that aren't professionally oriented.
As you reflect on those conversations that you had, and what an incredible group of folks that you were able to connect with, was there something, two questions I guess I have for you is, what perhaps was the biggest sort of aha moment you had, and maybe what was the biggest surprise that you walked away going, never would have thought of that?
Well, I think everyone wants to look for the silver bullet, like what's the one thing. And I think Jared Diamond, our Pulitzer Prize winning author on campus, kind of said the one thing is not to look for the one thing. Just because maybe bird watching or blueberries or crossword puzzles, works, doesn't mean that it works for everyone. And in fact, there's not even research to support all of those activities. So you have to find what works for you. Now, having said that, staying active in some form is clearly one thing that is important. And we know walking, physical activity, but definitely walking is something we can do as we get older, is something that leads to improvements in physical health, but also mental health. And some people were surprised to hear that some of the best research out there shows that people who walk 3 or more times a week have better memory performance than those who do not. And even neuroimaging studies show that the hippocampi, that parts of the brain that are involved in memory, that tend to decline after about the age of 50 by 1% every year, in the walking groups in these studies actually increased after 1 year of engaging in more physical activity. So your brain is literally getting bigger and growing.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you about, if you could explain, which again is one of the things I loved about your book. It was written for people like me, the non-scientists. So if you could explain to the me's of the world, the non-scientists, what happens with our brain as we age? I think you're starting to go there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a neuroscientist, but we do study memory changes.
But you play one on TV.
I play one on TV and maybe in my book. But without even looking at the brain, we know that memory becomes less efficient and tends to decline with age. And that doesn't just happen when you get your gray hairs. It happens almost after the age of 20. So people should be concerned and aware of it. But some of these declines are very natural and normal, and they can be accompanied by compensation, other memory systems that might get better with age. So semantic memory, our knowledge base of facts and information, might actually become more pronounced, even if we can't remember, where we parked our car last week or what we had for breakfast. And that's sometimes just because of all the experiences we have had. And I was always struck by my grandparents again, who, they couldn't remember my name sometimes, but they could remember how much bananas were at the grocery store, this week, and how they were on sale compared to last week. So I think what happens as we get older is we tend to focus on what's important to us. And that's something our lab has really latched onto and studied in more detail, that this selectivity, the ability to focus on what's important to you and perhaps forgetting the rest, even if it's other details, might be something that is more pronounced as we get older. And so we've shown that people, as we get older, are more prone to remember the things they're curious about. If you're interested in something, you'll make some effort to remember it. Maybe you'll tell it to other people, and maybe these sorts of things can help you remember it. Weather forecasts, grocery prices, whatever is
and I remember
really
something
relevant.
else you pointed out. If for those of you who haven't done it, I was sharing with Alan. I watched his TED Talk, and I think it was in your TED Talk you shared the story about the fire hydrant.
Yeah, we really tend to tune things out that aren't relevant to us. So this was a study we did on campus at UCLA, and it was motivated by one of my senior colleagues. We were both emergency floor wardens for our floor, kind of a volunteer position.
An important job. Did you get the best?
Very important job. Popular kids.
Yeah.
But our training involved having to know where the fire extinguisher was on our floor. And
extinguisher, not hydrants.
Yeah, when we were in the training room in the basement, neither of us could really recall on our 6th and 7th floor of what's now Pritzker Hall, where the fire extinguisher was. And we both knew that there probably was one, and I thought it was by the elevator, and my colleague thought maybe it was on every other floor because he hadn't noticed one. But when he went back to his office, he noticed it was right next to his office door. And he had had that office for 30 years. So in some ways, we stop noticing things that aren't relevant, that we don't use, and that might just be a kind of a natural phenomenon. And we've probably had this experience for other things, that we don't notice, what's around us unless it's relevant. And that might become more pronounced just with more experience and age. So I think that's a good demonstration.
When you told that story in the TED Talk, can you correct my memory, is you went back a couple weeks later and people that didn't remember remembered. So sometimes we remember that which we've made a mistake about or correct.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think that's something that's important, is instead of telling people the answer, like, oh, the fire extinguisher is down the hall, we had people engage in kind of discovery learning, where we said, okay, instead of me telling you where it is, I want you to get up and go and find it. And people would get out of their office chair and look down the hall and point down the hall, and then realize there was one right next to their door, or realize there's actually 3 nearby. And it's kind of, this is what we call metacognition. Once we become aware of how our memory works and how it fails us, and that might be something that happens more frequently as we get older, we can engage in some sort of process that can fill in these gaps. So when we came back and interviewed these people 3 months later, everyone knew where the fire extinguisher was, because they were so surprised that they'd missed it. So I think this sort of training can be very effective.
So are you still the floor warden?
I don't know what I'll be when we get back to our building, but I certainly noticed we just had a renovation.
Yeah.
The first thing I noticed was where the fire extinguishers were. So, everywhere I go, they follow me around.
We all have different legacies, I guess, huh?
Yeah.
So you had started a little bit ago talking about some of the techniques around preserving memory as we age. So getting into a few of those, how important is a good night's sleep?
Yeah, I think that's incredibly important, and it's tied to a lot of other things. So just to back up, I think this is another area where there's a lot of myths surrounding what we can do to keep our memory sharp, because I think most people will say right off the bat, crossword puzzles. And crossword puzzles can be very effective, but there's no really good research where you could randomly assign people to do crossword puzzles for 30 years versus another group not to, and then see how they do. So it's tough to know what's happening with the people who are doing crossword puzzles. So if you're good at crossword puzzles, great, there's no need to stop. But if you're not, that doesn't necessarily mean you have to do them. So I think we need to know what works and what might not. And the other thing is what sorts of things lead to big effects. Mm-hmm. And I think sleep, diet, social interaction, and exercise are probably like the big 3 or 4 things that we can do, that we do have some control over, and they influence one another. Because if you're getting good exercise, especially cardiovascular exercise, you'll probably sleep better. And if you sleep better, you're less likely to have these cravings for, soda and chocolate, which happens definitely to many of us, including myself, right around 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So, these things are not, there's not one thing to do. And I think the other thing is these brain training games. There's an incredible emphasis on how we can train our brain now. And we have a lot of opportunities to use these incredible computer-based video games, which are, to be honest, a lot of fun and can be very engaging. But the research really doesn't support that there's long-term gains that transfer over to the things that we might care about. And what that means is if you play these video games, you might get better at the game, and it certainly feels like you're getting better at these puzzles, and you are, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be better at finding your keys or remembering the name of someone you met yesterday. So you're not really training memory in a general way, you're just training very specific parts of memory.
Well, and going back to when you were talking about sleep and exercise and diet, could you also comment on the consistency with which one needs to engage in that to influence improving memory?
Yeah, I think that's another big thing I touch on in my book are kind of habits and hobbies. And, habits can be eating habits, but they can also be exercise that once it becomes more routine, if we're walking 3 days a week with a friend every Monday, Wednesday, Friday at 8 a.m., that's just something that's easier to do, where it's very hard to just say, get more exercise. Yeah. It's kind of like, well, how? Do I need to buy something? Do I need to go to the gym? But once you get into these routines, it's almost like it's hard to shake them. So a lot of the people I did interview, walking was a big thing. Even though a lot of people might have been runners, we know running is not necessarily something that can be maintained, especially for knees and hips. But I think that's kind of one of the biggest thing. And the other thing that I think is a little bit surprising that people overlook is balance. And that's something I learned in...
I was going to ask you about that next. I want to share with you. Before I go there, I also want to remind folks that in a couple minutes, we're going to go to your questions. And so if you have some questions, please write them in the chat room. And I'll stop asking the questions soon and get to yours. But earlier today, Alan, I was sharing with Rhea Turtletop, who is my boss. She had gone to one of your presentations a couple years ago. And she said, you have to promise me you're going to share this with him. And she brought up the balance and how you talked about you balance on one leg and then shift to the other. And she said that is still to this day how she and her husband brush the teeth. And they call it the Alan Castel brushing the teeth method with balance. So talk about that for a minute.
Well, I certainly got that tip and bit of advice from a very healthy older adult who said they practice that every day. And I thought, wow, that's something I should be doing. And when I did it, I realized just how bad my balance can be first thing in the morning, partly because I'm so distracted thinking about a million other things I want to do. And also just, we don't think about balance. So I think after the age of 65, 1 in 3 Americans will experience a fall, and a fall can lead to a broken hip, a broken collarbone, arm, hospitalization. That means you're not walking as much. Then we know your memory starts to decline. And for a lot of people, that's kind of a big step in the wrong direction.
Mm-hmm.
So what can we do to improve our balance when we're not even aware that we have poor balance? So I think the first step is to be aware that even if you're walking and you've never had a fall, that doesn't mean you have good balance. So, check in with yourself. And, if I was doing this talk live, I'd ask everyone to stand up on one leg and, see how long you can hold it. And you notice you'd be wobbling around a little bit. And if you can do that, try closing your eyes, and then everyone really experience. But that's very much what it's like when you get up in the middle of the night and you have to use the bathroom and you're kind of walking through. You could trip on a carpet, a pet. And that, this happened to John Wooden. He was, he tripped, he fell at night, he broke his collarbone and wrist, I think. He was on the floor for 6 or 7 hours, waiting for a caretaker to come in the morning. And thankfully, he survived the fall. But training balance can be something that we don't need to go to a yoga studio. We don't need to spend a lot of money. And so I check in and do this balance training in the morning. But, there's many things we can do to make sure we stay on our feet.
I was automatically thinking about tree pose and yoga, but I guess I could do that brushing my teeth too. One other recommendation you had that I found was really interesting is that write 500 words or so to describe our life. How does that, where does that fit into some of the tools in the toolkit?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the older adults I spoke to were very eager to share their story. And I was so fascinated to hear where they were from, the challenges they encountered, the ups and downs in their lives, some of the positivity that they had, but it wasn't that their life was always positive. So I think when we summarize our life, and something as we get older might be more important if you share it with a grandchild or, other family, or document it. But I think the key here is to kind of keep it short, because if it's not short, you're not going to do it. You're not going to write your book. And so this was this is an exercise called guided autobiography. It's something that some others have developed, and it's you can do it in more detail and meet every week with others and exchange stories, or you can just write, a couple of pages about your life. And I think it also engages some gratitude, some awareness of how finite life is, how fortunate we are to be, healthy, happy, surrounded by others who care about us, and think of the highlights in our life and what we're still doing and what sorts of things we want to do. So I think it's a good way to reflect a little bit on, where we are.
Thanks. I really appreciate that, especially given the space that we're in now. So thank you. You mentioned silver bullet a couple minutes ago. So I want to ask you about one of those, happiness. Does happiness increase the lifespan?
Yeah, it's very, happiness is always a tough one to define. And happiness or life satisfaction could be, that could be, happiness might just be in the moment. Are you happy? Some people think if you're smiling, you're happy, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's true. I think as we age, life satisfaction and happiness might be related. But I think that's another one of those surprising things, that there is this, there's this U-shaped function, that happiness doesn't just get worse or better or decline. It's kind of this interesting relationship that the people who seem to be the least happy are the people in middle age. And, that's my age, I'll admit. And I was actually, in a way, happy to learn that, because it made me feel like, well, I feel like there are challenges in my life, and although I feel very fortunate, it's nice to know that if you're healthy and happy and, engaging in these activities, it can get better. Mm-hmm. So I think it's an important message to send to people that, it's not like, when you were 18, that was the best time in your life and it's all downhill. Mm-hmm. And I think we define happiness in different ways at different points in our life. So I think it's probably more complicated than that, but there's some interesting research showing that people who are happier live longer, but sometimes happiness and health go hand in hand.
Well, I think you made this point in a number of different ways in your book was, as we get older, some of the things that mattered ever so much, perhaps when we were middle-aged, aren't those paper cuts that they were once for us. So right. Appreciated that. So talk a little bit, now the book is out. What are you and your lab working on now? What's next?
Yeah, we're really interested in how people engage in what we call selective remembering or value-directed remembering. it's partly motivated.
What is value-directed memory?
It's just a way to show that we can't remember everything we're exposed to, nor should we even try. And I think as we get older, we might actually be better at forgetting the things that are least important, but selectively focusing on what's most important. So, if value or what we think is important drives our memory, then this value-directed remembering might actually be a mechanism that allows older adults to selectively focus on what's most important and forget what's least important. And so we've been trying to conceptualize what that means. And sometimes that involves just talking to older adults and saying, what challenges do you encounter? What things can you remember well? My grandparents were great with grocery prices because, they lived through an era where that was an important thing to them. Curiosity, what if, as we get older, we might focus more on, if it's bird watching or, sports or whatever it is, you can have exceptionally good memory for, statistics and useless baseball stats. But if that's what interests you, that shows that your memory is probably tuned to the things that you care about. So our lab's very interested in that and kind of showing that it's not all a decline. And in fact, to flip it, it's that a lot of the college students, the freshmen, come in with great memories, very smart, studious, but they have challenges in this ability to selectively focus on what's important. They'll come to me during office hours and say, I got a B or a C on my exam, but I studied, and they show me their textbook, and 80% of the textbook is highlighted. So I think the real challenge there is being able to figure out what's important, focus on that, and that's something we learn as we get older.
So how does one get to be a student in your lab?
We have a lot of volunteers. These are students, undergraduate students. Some of them are doing honors theses. Some of them are doing independent research. And then we have a terrific group of graduate students from all over the country. And so I feel it's a great group. We're always eager to expand the lab, get more funding to attract more people. We did a lot of in-person testing and had a lot of older adults coming to our lab, which I think kind of enhances the diversity on campus. I hope that'll continue. We don't know what the timeline is for that, so we've switched a lot of our testing to online testing or over the phone. So maybe some of you will hear from me in the future, but maybe you'll get a letter in the mail. But that's a lot of younger people really enjoy working with older adults, and I think it helps enhance their perspective on what it means to age well.
So we have a lot of questions coming through. So I'm going to ask you one more question before we get to our listener questions. And that is, 10, 20 years from now, you and I have an opportunity to reconnect over what technology is present. Where do you see yourself in your life, 20 years from now?
Gosh, 20 years ago, I wouldn't have thought I'd be at UCLA in Southern California, living through a pandemic. That's
true.
I think technology has helped us immensely. It's made the world more complicated in some ways as well. I've heard older adults also comment on that. It's great to get a letter in the mail and now through email, but I think what's concerning is when we're getting so many messages and so much information and so little of it has kind of the value that we care about the most. So I think that's still the challenge, is how do we selectively focus on what's important to us, especially in this era where the internet is there, there's endless amounts of information. There's a lot of scams out there that take advantage of people who are looking to, explore the world or meet new people. So I fear that that's also something we really need to be on the lookout. As technology enhances our life, there's also some costs that we need to be on the lookout for. So I always try and discuss that when I talk about getting, successful aging and what it means. Sometimes it means avoiding things that can be very, very concerning.
Well, you had mentioned this before too, even in our current state, we're doing so much Zooming now. A lot of folks are saying it's okay still to pick up the phone and call somebody and check in. So kind of varying up that technology.
Yeah, I think not only is it okay, it's important. And, hearing someone's voice, sometimes you get more captured by what they're actually saying than, the look on their face or their background or whatever else is going on. And I think just having the opportunity to Zoom all the time doesn't necessarily mean we're getting closer to people. So phone calls, or even, some people walking by on the street is, if you're on the other side of the street, that's fine. It's good to just see familiar faces.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I totally agree with you. Human contact right now is so important, and however we can do that. And as we've also realized through Zoom, our Zoom backgrounds can have us be just about anywhere in the world. Okay, so we're going to go to some questions from listeners now. First one I'm going to ask you is, what do you think of supplements for improving memory?
Yeah, I always answer these sorts of questions with the warning that I'm not a medical doctor, and nor am I a clinical psychologist. So maybe that'll ward off some of the other questions. But what I've heard is there's not one thing that you need to be taking. It's not necessarily ginkgo or blueberries, especially in our Western diet where we do tend to get plenty of things. If you're eating a balanced diet, you should be fine. There are even some placebo effects, so I don't want to spoil them for you, but if you feel you need something, I still feel like a walk every day or every other day is going to have much more of a positive effect on you than any supplement that you can take. So that's the short story. I'm sure there's research out there to support certain supplements, and if you have deficiencies, then probably it makes sense. You should talk to your medical doctor about these things, but as far as I know, there's not one thing you really need to be taking. I think if there is, and every time I say this, people say, well, what's the one thing? And I say, it's physical exercise. It's free. It's outside. You can do it whenever you want. People kind of are like disappointed. They want to, well, how about red wine? And how about blueberries? Or how about chocolate? And all of those things sound appealing, but the effect size or the research that supports it is not crystal clear.
It's back to that silver bullet.
Exactly.
So here's another question for you. Does memory ever come back after ECT treatment?
Yeah, again, it's more in a clinical domain. Some memories can be lost. Memory is such a complicated thing that some people say, forgetting happens, but other people say that it's always in there. You just don't have access to it. And that may very well be true. And that's why some cues can be very strong. Like maybe you haven't thought of something in a long time. You go to your high school reunion and all of a sudden everything comes flooding back to you. Things you hadn't thought about in a long time, people you hadn't thought about, just because of the cues, the environment that you're around. So I think our environment can play a very big role in what we can access. So, whether it's smell or talking to someone or seeing someone or going on a trip back to where you're from originally can play a big role in accessing memories. But I don't specifically know with ECT.
Yeah. Or, there's all kinds of triggers that do that. It's that song from high school.
Yeah, the song, the smell of freshly cut grass. Music absolutely can. You see a lot of older adults when they listen to music, they'll say, I remember this like it was yesterday. Or so music seems to really engage the brain that can jog memory in important ways.
And if they're like me in my memory, I'm a much better dancer now than I was in high school.
And singer too.
Exactly. So here's a longer kind of a scenario question for you. Have you found that in those situations where a couple grow old together, they seem to actually grow closer, become more in love with each other, and that in turn, they create a level of inspiration in their children that take those children by surprise? Gary says that his parents are 85 and 91.5. He'll be 65 in 3 weeks. And now he and his wife have their own grandchild, 6 months old, and really are missing that close physical contact, as I think many of us are with loved ones. And he finds himself learning more from his parents now than he ever did as a youth or young adult.
Yeah, I think that's definitely an observation I've seen with couples and also adult children, noticing what their parents went through and understanding it a bit better once they've gone through it. And I think maybe it was Mark Twain who said, the older I got, the smarter my parents seemed to be. And I think that's true, especially for couples who can make it work. And it's very inspiring. There's a level of intimacy and closeness that you'll never have with anyone else. And, not that we need role models, but John Wooden's spouse passed away well before he did. And he wrote her a letter every month. He wouldn't sleep on her side of the bed. So that there's also a level of loss when a spouse passes away. So I think that's an incredibly important bond. And in terms of role models for successful aging, a lot of the freshmen that I teach in my freshman seminar will comment on their grandparents, but also their marriage and how it's inspiring for them.
It's when you mentioned Wooden's talking about Nan. I remember reading so many articles where he would also talk about one of his biggest regrets is that he didn't dance enough with his wife.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think when we look back on our lives, we spend a lot of our time worrying about money or jobs. And, these things certainly do matter at the time, but there are other important things that we might look back on and regret.
So kind of on the theme of going down this road, how does depression affect memory and what can we do about that?
Yeah, again, a good question for a clinical psychologist. Depression and aging can go hand in hand for various reasons, and can influence memory. And there's definitely research showing that if you have depression, you might not be able to engage in the same level of memory you used to. And of course, there's a lot of pharmacological treatments, but I think the best thing, again, is physical exercise. If you can go on walks, be around other people, get better night's sleep, that can play a tremendous role in how well your memory
Here's a question I think you'll appreciate about exercise. Somebody wants to know, can we do too much exercise?
Mm-hmm. No, it's a good question.
It's something I would ask you.
Yeah. I mean, there's no just right amount. You really need to gauge it. And that's, research is still trying to figure that out. There's certainly different types of exercise that can be more helpful than others in terms of cardiovascular benefits, because that's probably why that you get memory benefits, is you're getting more blood flow to the brain, and the brain kind of is, hogging that good glucose oxygenated blood. So the more that you can get there, the better. So it doesn't have to be running, but some people say, well, what if I'm walking, 2 hours a day? And as long as your joints can handle these sorts of things, I always think it's good. I use this term balance in beyond just physical balance, but balance the types of physical activity you have, whether it's walking, swimming, biking, gardening. All of these things can have different benefits. And so I think we need to kind of figure out what works for us. Some things will have to change. Maybe you used to play tennis or squash or marathon running. And, Bill Clinton and, John Glenn, who I interviewed, said he traded in his running for walking more regularly. John would walk around the track at UCLA. And that's kind of how you collect your thoughts. So I think it's not just about the physical exercise, it's having that balance in your life.
When along with that, somebody else is asking about evidence to support the benefits of meditation as we age.
Yeah, that's definitely another hot area of research. And certainly there can be some big benefits when we reflect and have some time to let our minds wander, but also gather our thoughts. And I think, there's a center at UCLA that's looking at these benefits. And so I think it's something, that might be new for some people, and I think it's worth trying, because that's another thing we know that can help people, is trying new things and seeing if they work.
When I think with meditation too, meditation also brings a certain focus with it that maybe aligns with some of the other things that you were talking about.
Absolutely.
So another question is, how does grief, in particular losing a spouse, affect aging?
Yeah, that's a big one. And when I've talked to older adults, that's kind of the one that they'll focus on the most, is that as they get older, more of their friends are moving away, passing away. And if a spouse does pass away, that can often, be something that can trigger a lot of emotion and anxiety. It can sometimes result in a reduced social network. And so how we respond to this can be very important. It's certainly something that can trigger a lot of anxiety, because it's also sometimes associated with financial aspects or moving. Sometimes it means, moving to another place. And so I think loneliness can also be an issue. Social isolation and loneliness are sometimes two different things, because, sometimes people can be around each other but still feel lonely, and vice versa. So I think, that is one of the biggest things that people will say. On the other hand, there's a lot of companionship in older age, that older adults will report that they're interested in meeting other people. I think sometimes you need to be careful, but having the right people around you can be very important during that time in your life.
When I think, I reflect on, you've talked a number of times in our conversation about the importance of those social connections. And I think particularly when you're grieving, it's easy to go into an isolated kind of a place. So.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you have, sometimes it's not just adult children who will pull you out of that. It's really important to have I talk about some of the people I interviewed being a regular somewhere. If you're just a regular at the coffee shop or at the library or, whatever you do, when people see you regularly, that can be important for you and for them. Checking up on you, seeing how you're doing, those sorts of things sometimes we take for granted.
Well, particularly when you're living alone, and I think that's important now. I've talked to a number of colleagues that are living on their own in socialized, in the physical isolation that we have now, and the importance of checking in and those phone calls. So on a different topic, does moderate consumption of alcohol affect memory as you get older? 6 ounces of glass of wine a day for a female, 2 glasses of wine for a male. Very specific in this question.
Yeah. There's research out there, and a lot of it is correlational, so it's tough to know. We can't, randomly assign people to drink or not drink, and moderation is definitely the key here. Some research shows that any amount of alcohol is not going to help you, but some research shows that a moderate amount might actually be beneficial, and I think that might be tied to other factors that, if you're having a glass of wine or, a drink once a week in a social setting, it might be the social components and being around other people and having that enjoyment that might be just as beneficial as the alcohol. So I think, I would never advise to drink or, more to improve your memory, but I think there might be things associated with alcohol consumption that can enhance, how we enjoy ourselves.
Well, I think that's really helpful. That's a good follow-up for folks that identify one with the other, is what is it about the situation that may be the connection for you? And sometimes it's the people. So here's a different question as well. How do we know when we are just losing memory capability as a result of getting older, or when diminishing memory is an onset of something more serious, like Alzheimer's?
Yeah, that's always a concern. And I think there's always a lot of anxiety surrounding our memory changes. When you're younger, you might have changes in memory, but you kind of say it's because I'm distracted. And the first thing that people often will say, I'm terrible at remembering names. We talked about this a little bit before we went on. And there's a good reason for that, because names don't really have much semantic or much meaning. So I tell people my last name rhymes with pastel, and my grandfather was a painter. And now you can kind of have some sort of mental image and you know how it's pronounced. But memory for names is something that's often quite challenging at any age, and it's not always something to be necessarily concerned about. That's kind of a normal change, and we don't do much with names. Another kind of not clinical test, but asking yourself, do you know the, where you parked your car? That's something people often have challenges with.
I'm usually the one in the parking lot with the clicker.
Right. So there's ways to help yourself. But, the joke is, if you can't remember where you parked your car, that's kind of normal. That's because of the interference of having parked there many times or not paying attention. But if you can't remember if you own a car, that's more concerning, right? Like that's kind of the quick and dirty test. And there are some issues about memory anxiety that can then influence memory. So if you're concerned about your memory and you're anxious and you're tested for dementia with someone in a white coat, that can lead to a lot of anxiety and lead to underperforming in your memory. So there's a number of factors that are at play here, but if you are concerned, you should definitely consult a neurologist. And there are some tests that they can do, but it's very difficult to diagnose dementia at its very early stages. So sometimes it's a spouse or partner who might notice, pronounced changes, also changes in personality. So it's not all about memory. Often it's first attention, changes in personality, mood, these sorts of things. So it's a complicated, there's not one test that we can do that can definitely diagnose dementia.
No, thank you for that. So we've talked about technology a little bit. Here's a fun question for you. Have Google searches helped or hurt seniors in remembering things? Blame it on the Google.
Right. Yeah, no, I don't think this is specific to seniors either. I think we're just so prone to being able to look things up that we don't need to store things in our personal memory. And in some ways, that's not such a bad thing. If even undergraduates would say, why do I need to know things if I can just look it up? And in some ways, they might be right. But we also need to generally know where we can find things and know if it's a reliable source. So I think we do want to have some sort of knowledge system that allows us to guide us to the right answer or guide us to where we can look. And it used to be an encyclopedia. Now it's Google. And I think we still need to be discerning regarding how we find information. But, you know, it's also exciting that you can go on and on looking up things on the internet and learning a lot.
Mm-hmm. Could affect in your ability to get a good night's sleep, though.
Yeah, absolutely. You do need to know where to draw the line and not be staring at your computer past a certain hour.
So after writing obituaries for my mother and my sister, I decided to write my own. Since my daughter does not know about awards and positions I had in my occupation, I sent it to her and asked her to update it when the time comes. What do you think about that?
Well, you're well prepared, and I think you're doing it's a kind thing to do for your relatives too, because that way they know what you're most proud of and the things that are important to you. I think it's a good exercise. I've certainly, you know, I'll admit it's not an obituary, but I've certainly summarized my life in this guided autobiography, a 500-word kind of summary.
Mm-hmm.
And it certainly gives you time to reflect on what's important to you. And there's certainly awards and professional recognition, but and sometimes it's not just those things that take up the most room. It's the personal things, the challenges you've had in your life, the things you've done, the things you wanted to do, but you're kind of happy you never did, or you're happy to share that you never did that.
The bucket list.
Yeah, I think it's you know, it's a good thing to do in some ways, and especially if you're sharing it with someone. I think it's helpful. How did she react? I'm curious.
We'll see if she can give us a response to that.
All right.
There's a question for the questioner. So here's not a question, but some feedback for you. He says, I don't have a question, but appreciate that you spoke of older adults rather than the elderly. Some of us do not want to be thought of as elderly. In your interviews, here is a question. In your interviews, did anyone speak to the terminology that is used? Senior citizens, elderly, older population?
No, it's a great comment and observation. And I've tried to always stick to older adults, but then that's relative, like relative to what? And at what age do we consider someone to be old? And that's still a research question and a public policy question, because when should we draw Social Security? And it's different in different countries. Mm-hmm. And it's also changing. Retirement age is changing. You know, when my father had mandatory retirement at 65 in Canada, and you know that is going to have to be changing and updated. And also the labels we use are incredibly important, because senior citizen, you know, some people don't mind that if it's in the context of a senior's discount.
Right.
But I try and be careful to use terms that I feel comfortable with and that older people feel comfortable with. And I think it's very important, because sometimes we perform according to the labels that we have. And I even feel uncomfortable sometimes using the term older adult, because one thing that I was always struck by is that a better predictor of how well we perform on memory tests and even our longevity, how long we'll live, is not our age, our actual biological age, but our subjective age, how old we feel. And how old we feel changes after the age of 40. Typically, people who are healthy feel younger than their actual age by about 20%. Mm-hmm. And so if you ask someone, you know, how old they are versus how old they feel, you might get two different answers. And, you know, for some people that can be incredibly important, because, you know, why am I being addressed like someone who's 75 when I don't feel 75?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, here's another question about depression. How do depression and meds for it affect memory? And is there anything you can do about that?
Yeah, and it's a great question. It's an important one. Again, probably more geared towards a clinical psychologist. You know, medication in general, and especially, you know, today people tend to take more than one medication for a variety of things, can influence things that we know are related to memory, namely sleep, mood, and, you know, motivation. So if these things are, you know, influencing whether you exercise or not, if they influence how well you eat and when you eat and how well you sleep, it's not surprising it's going to have an effect on memory. So sometimes it's not the medication specifically, it's, you know, all of these side effects or interactions that can have an impact on things we know can improve or impact memory.
Mm-hmm. So someone would like for you to talk about the relationship of our diet to inflammation, causing our brain to fog up and our body starts to ache and to pain. Did any of the people that you interview have inflammation in their joints? And does detoxing our liver or our gut have any impact on healthy aging?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's an important one. It's a little bit of a moving target because a lot of the people I interviewed wouldn't really talk so much about diet because to them diet was either a balanced diet or it was a diet 30 or 40 years ago. And I think the irony is interesting here because even 20 years ago people would avoid eating the egg yolk.
Yeah.
Right? It was egg whites that seemed like they're okay. Now it's just the opposite. This is like. It's the same with a hamburger bun. It used to be people thought meat had a lot of fat in it, so you wanted to avoid it. And now people will avoid the bun because of the carbohydrates, but go for the protein. So I think it's a bit of a moving target. There's definitely some good research on inflammation, suggesting that it's related to all sorts of things, like including memory decline. And so, diets that can prevent inflammation can be very important, especially for people who experience these sorts of things.
When somebody is actually asking about that, you've mentioned foods a little bit, but someone is asking about, are there any foods that you can recommend that we should eat or that are helpful in terms of memory issues?
Yeah, I guess I know people want the one food or at least a few foods. It's very difficult, again, since I'm not a medical doctor or clinical practitioner. I think having some sort of balance is good. There's definitely some research showing blueberries are good or things that are anti-inflammatory, but you certainly just wouldn't want to eat those. And nor, we often have cravings for things, and it's okay to satisfy those cravings. And as long as that's not, consuming everything that you're getting all your calories from. So I think balance is important here, but inflammation, and again, it's moving because some people, gluten is a big issue now for adults, but also for children. And that wasn't the case 20 or 30 years ago. So we need to update our beliefs and be aware of what things might play an important role both now and in the future.
So can you talk a little bit about the role of intergenerational connections in healthy aging and how to cultivate those connections?
Yeah, I think that's important. And culturally speaking, the United States is certainly not the best in terms of recognizing and appreciating older adults and even keeping older adults in the home. And, in some countries and in some circumstances, you'll have 3 generations in one house: grandparents, parents, and children. And I think that can have tremendous benefits, both for the grandparents to have assistance and for the children to see what it's like to get old and to learn from your grandparents. I would spend a lot of time with my grandparents, and I saw, all sorts of things. They would also share a lot of stories with me that my parents would not share or had not shared. So I learned a lot from them. And I think that makes you more family oriented and aware of your history and your roots. So I think there's many benefits to that, but in our culture, sometimes that's not the case. That sometimes older people move to senior centers, and that's considered a great thing that you're doing. And in many cases it can be if you have the financial means. But in other countries, other cultures, other settings, I think there can be benefits to having multiple generations together.
So I'm just curious, have you found that your children have the same kind of experience with their grandparents as you did with yours?
That's a great question. And, it's probably, living farther apart from my parents. My wife's parents are here, which is great. And they certainly get a lot of interaction, and we get a lot more babysitting. And so I think that's really beneficial for them. But they certainly have age-based stereotypes. Like they notice their grandfather has arthritis. They notice that, he walks a little bit more hunched over. They notice their grandmother likes to bake and is generous with money with them. And so these are things they'll remember their entire life. And so I think it's great that they can spend time with their grandparents. I certainly wish I could spend more time with my own grandparents who'd passed away when I was younger. And so I cherish those memories that I have and the photographs I have.
I definitely agree with you on that. So here's a fun question for you. After interviewing Coach Wooden, are you now eating blueberry donuts or a donut while walking?
Yeah, it's a sad day because of COVID, but Stan's Donuts just went out of business, and that was, I got to interview Stan for this book, and I also, John Wooden's favorite donut was the blueberry buttermilk from Stan's Donuts, so that's an era in history now. But it just goes to show it's, a donut a day seemed to do just fine with Stan. It's not something I think we'd advise anyone, but I'll definitely miss those blueberry buttermilk donuts. But I'll take a lot of advice that John Wooden gave me about walking and physical exercise. And he shared probably that the two, if people are looking for the two silver bullets, he told me, and in fact, he didn't tell me, he had me guess the two most important words in the English language and how they applied to living a long and healthy life. And if this were a live presentation, I would ask the audience now to guess those two words. I'll have you think about them for a little bit. The first word was love. He said, losing his wife, having a loving family, these are the things that he'll cherish. And, that's what was so important to him. Finding who you love, finding what you love. So, what you're passionate about, whether it's your profession, whether it's a hobby, whether it's some sort of pursuit, just having that passion and interest in your life is incredibly important. And the second word, which I struggled with both of them, the second word is something we've already talked about. And that's why I always bring it up in these sorts of interviews. And I won't have you guess, Julie, but
thank you for that.
The second word is balance. And he said both physical balance and mental balance in your life. And the physical balance we've already talked about, and that's something Wooden experienced, falling and just being aware of balance, but just having balance. And he even said, at many points in his life, he did not have balance. He focused, long work hours. He was, very dedicated to sport, being a teacher. You have to balance being a parent and being in a family and doing all sorts of things that, take a lot of time. And so I think that's something we all both struggle and enjoy in our life. It's probably something especially relevant now, considering we're all at home doing things in ways that don't necessarily lend well to balance. So those are the two things that really came out of both that interview and I think were the theme for the book as well.
Yeah, no, that definitely came through. Patty wants to know, do you have a game that you would suggest to improve memory? Any particular game?
Well, I don't know if there's any game in particular. I know a lot of people enjoy things like Trivial Pursuit or, games that test knowledge. It's kind of silly, but one game my wife and I play when we go food shopping, and again, it reminds me of my grandparents, is we quiz each other on, what we bought and how much it cost. And I think that's something that, you then start to realize, oh, why can I remember this, but I can't remember that? Oh, I didn't look, or it's changed, or did you notice that avocados are more expensive, or avocado oil has gone up in price? So it's kind of like a motivated game. It's kind of an interesting game. I don't know if it has any benefits in terms of memory. I'm hesitant to recommend any of these computer-based games. If you enjoy them, great. But I think the one reason I hesitate is they lead to more screen time, and more screen time is the one thing we know probably will take away from more time exercising. So you have to be careful and probably, again, have balance.
Here's an interesting question for you. Could value-directed memory explain today's polarized political climate?
That's an excellent question, and one that definitely requires more research. But I think that might be kind of a really interesting thing to look at, because our values do guide what we pay attention to and what we think is important, and then what we remember and what we communicate towards others. So it could be both for younger and older adults. Value-directed remembering could play a really important role, and where we get our news from. So it's not just a memory thing, it's an attention. That's a great bit of insight. So
do you use UCLA alumni who are older in your research studies?
Absolutely. We're always looking for research participants. And at these sorts of talks, I'm always keen to share that, our research studies are being offered on campus. Now they're being offered online as well. So I'm happy to share our contact information. We have a website. And
what we'll do is Justin, who emailed the fabulous bio around you, will send out a note to all who are on the call and share the contact information for the lab.
Please do. Yeah, I'd appreciate that. And anyone who's interested in learning more and getting involved, we'd love to have you.
So how important is spirituality to successful aging?
Yeah, that's, again, a really important one, tough to experimentally examine, but a lot of older adults will return back to religion. And if it's not just for religion, it's, again, for that social community or something that's bigger than yourself, being around people with kind of similar interests and learning from other people as well. And it provides a great setting where you can interact with other people your age and different ages, people with similar beliefs, perhaps some with different political beliefs. So a lot of older adults will emphasize the importance of it. And I think it also relates to family. So if it's not just religion, it's celebrating holidays or traditions that can be important. And I know a lot of my early childhood memories are based on traditions, you know, when we celebrated different holidays, when family was around, whether they were religious or not, or if I even understood the religion behind them. Those are things that I now repeat with my family and children, and it brings us together. And it's a great way to both teach them things and make them aware of, you know, our background and our culture and other people's, and also just to enjoy all the festivities and family that can be around during these great events.
When I think ritual takes place in many different ways. So for, you know, so how we define it within our own families is unique to the culture of our own families. So.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So one of our listeners asks or observes, my late husband and I were married almost 46 years, no children, so we did everything together. Cancer took him in 2016, and I'm still adjusting to being solo. Suggestions for stimulating my mind, interacting with others besides immediate family.
Yeah, it's a challenge. I think one thing a lot of older adults will turn to is, you know, lifelong learning is not something that ever gets old. There's ways that you can engage yourself with others, and not so much in a classroom now, but finding something that you are passionate about because you were passionate about someone, and now being around other people who are passionate about things that you're interested in, whether it's politics or knitting or headlines of newspapers and meeting people at libraries or exercise clubs. It can be daunting and it can be very intimidating at first, especially if you're going on your own. But the older adults that I've interacted with say that those things really have added a lot of richness to their life, even if it's not being around, you know, great friends all the time. It's just being around people that they've gotten to know over the years. So reaching out for those opportunities can be very rewarding.
So could you speak to short-term versus long-term memory function with aging?
Yeah, that's an important distinction. And a lot of people will say, you know, certain memories seem to fade very quickly, whereas they can remember like yesterday something that happened 20 or 30 years ago. And that's just one of the mysteries of memory, that some of these memories are well organized and consolidated. They're memories you've drawn on many times, and we know retrieving memories can actually strengthen the memory. Yet we'll walk into a room, and this happens to me, and can't remember why we walked into that room. So I give people some quick feedback on that, and I say the best thing you can do, and this is advice from my mother-in-law, is leave that room again, walk back into the other room where you had that initial thought or intention, and it might come back to you because that's where the cue, the environment is right. And if it doesn't, then just walk back into the other room and just keep walking, because we know walking is good for your memory. So it's a bit of a humorous way of illustrating that some of these things are in short-term memory are fleeting, but they can come back to us. And I think, again, in terms of value-directed remembering or what's important, if I sometimes forget things and I think, gosh, if it's important, I'll remember it. It'll come back to me later. And a lot of us have had that tip of the tongue feeling where we know something and we just can't access it. And then in the middle of the night, it comes to us, or the next day. And I think that's just, you know, having a lot on our minds and a lot in our minds. That's a normal thing that happens as we get older. And a lot of the information we don't need right away. So it's not something to be necessarily concerned about.
So Charlotte asks, she observes, it seems like getting a good night's sleep gets harder as you age. Any tips?
Yeah, definitely sleep. The amount of time we sleep, but mostly the sleep quality can decline with age. And those are things to be especially aware of. Sometimes it's frustrating to, you know, get a good night's sleep and just try harder. I think exercise is very important in this regard. Having some good sleep hygiene, just making sure your room is the right temperature, that, you know, you don't have distractions or televisions or other things that kind of keep you up. Another thing to be aware of is sleep apnea. Some people are not aware that they might have sleep disturbances that prevent them from getting a good night's sleep. So that's something to talk to your doctor if you're really having trouble. You know, you might sleep a long period of time or seem to be in bed for a while, but, you know, can't achieve some sort of deeper level.
So wake up tired. Yeah. So we're coming to the close of our time together, and I have to say this has just gone so fast. I really appreciate your willingness to answer just about everything that we've thrown at you. However, my last question for you is this one: is I know you've been interviewed a lot about your research in the book. Is there anything that you wanted to put out there that we haven't covered and offer a closing statement?
Well, that's pretty much why I wrote this book, is I would give these sorts of talks or Q&As, and people would say, where can I learn more? And there's just so much out there on the internet. There's new research, and it's hard to put it all together. I struggle trying to understand what the latest research is. So I really wrote this book for that reason, to give people some idea of what people say works and what some role models have been doing, just to show the diversity that's out there. And it's not going to work for everyone, but also what the research says. So I think that's kind of important to weigh, what research says, what people say, what we still don't understand, and there's a lot we don't understand about how we age. But I always enjoy talking to people about this topic, and it's a lot of fun doing these interviews.
Well, thank you so much for taking time from your evening and your family to spend it with us. And hopefully you will continue to stay safe and healthy and continue to do the amazing research that you're doing. And we look forward to your next book. So thank you so much.
Thank you. It was great.
So for those of you that have stayed with us, thank you so much. And so sorry we did not get to all of your questions. They're great questions. And Justin will be sending a follow-up email that will include the contact information for Alan as well as for the lab. And I also want to share with you that our next second act is scheduled on June 4th, 5 to 6:30. And the title of it is No Time Like Now, Career Recraft with transition coach John Tarnoff. So again, our second act is all about this information that you'd like to have us share with you with our fabulous faculty and our speakers, and perhaps a few tips on how we can maybe even reinvent ourselves. So thank you so much for tonight, and really hope again that particularly in this time that you stay safe, you stay healthy, and as suggested by Alan, that as a Bruin community that we stay connected. Because that's what Bruins do, is to lift one another and to be connected to one another. So thank you for spending time with us tonight, and look forward to seeing you in June, if not before. Thank you so much. Good night.